The items that I've pulled out today haven't really been taken out for any specific reason. There's no reason that any of these connect to each other. They don't have any sort of unified story. These are all just items that I've run across cataloging things at History House, organizing things. These are things that we have in cabinets and drawers and filed away that people usually don't see. We have an immense amount of items here in addition to the ones that you usually see on display. So I thought I'd bring these out and let people take a look at them. The first one here, this is a yearbook from 1892. Skowhegan High School didn't issue its first official yearbook, the Lever, until 1894. They've been doing it ever since then. But this one predates that. This is back when you basically had to make your own yearbook. You would get a photo album of the time, and all of your friends would have their pictures taken, and then you would put them into the album one at a time. And so it's very much an improvised album, although the photos do have backs that have Skowhegan High School's logo on them and the class of 1892 written on there as well. This was used not just as a photo album for the school, but for the individual girl whose album it was. She put family snapshots in there going all the way back to the Civil War. So this is a memento not just of class, but of her life. Behind it we have a surveying compass and surveyor's chain. These are on display because of how important surveying was to the entire area back hundreds of years ago. For a long time, central Maine was an uncharted wilderness, or at least if it was charted, it was charted with many overlapping claims about ownership. There were French claims, there were English claims, there were different companies who claimed different amounts of land, different people claimed different amounts of land, so one of the most important things to do was to survey it. So you read about settlers, just about every early settler you'll read about in the area did some surveying in Skowhegan, in Cornville, in Madison, in Norridgewock, up the river all the way up to the Canadian lines. Someone like Samuel Weston, who was the first settler in the area, was a surveyor. Someone like Ephraim Ballard, who was the husband of Martha Ballard, the woman who wrote A Midwife's Tale, the history of her midwifery in Augusta in the 1780s, 90s, and 1800s. He was also a surveyor and surveyed much of the area. Daniel Stewart, who owned the land that History House was built on. John Neal, who owned the land that is at the top of the hill from History House. We see Levi Weston, who was a descendant of Samuel Weston and owned a sawmill in town. You can go through a list of people in town, and just about anyone you come to will have surveyed either part-time or full-time for a while. And this technology was really fairly widespread because of how well you had to do it. We have several surveying compasses in History House and a set of surveyors' chains. And these were basically designed so that you could measure out a 1 yard square piece of land. Each link was 2/3 of a foot, which meant that 100 links, which is your standard length of chain, would be 66 feet, which would mean that a yard would be 10 chains square. And that was how you measured these out. These political cartoons are about the movement of the county seat in Somerset County in 1872, which was a fairly big event in county politics. Norridgewock had begun as the county seat because it was a more historical town than Skowhegan. Its roots went back further. But eventually, as the years went by, as the railroad came to Skowhegan and terminated, as the town built up an industrial center, Norridgewock sort of declined in importance, and the county business began to gravitate to Skowhegan. And for that reason, the state of Maine felt that it would be important to move the county seat to Skowhegan, which was much more in the heart of things in the county. This was done by a vote of the legislature, moving the seat from Norridgewock to Skowhegan. The difficulty with that being, no one from Somerset County was directly consulted except for their representatives in the legislature. People from Skowhegan were fine with that, but people from Norridgewock, people from other towns, Bingham, Solon, Madison, Anson, were not as much happy about that, because Norridgewock was unhappy for obvious reasons. They were losing the Shire Town designation, but other towns they saw it giving up a chance to be the Shire Town. So just about the only people in the county who would have voted for this would be people from Skowhegan, you can imagine. So there was a large political uproar about this throughout 1872. It became a big issue. Democrats, Republicans against each other, people from Somerset County, people from outside of Somerset County against each other. And that's really reflected in the confusion of the cartoons. You see they've got the courthouse on skates, there's a horse that's hauling it, it's running over a donkey, there's an elephant pulling it in another direction, there's a train off in the background, sort of reflecting the role of the railroad in all of this. It's very confused, and it was a very confused political situation. The legislature tried to pass a few bills. In the election of 1872 that came shortly thereafter, many people who opposed the move of the courthouse were elected. And really the only thing that quelled all of the tensions was a move by Abner Coburn, one of Skowhegan's native sons and a former governor. With his own money, Governor Coburn built a courthouse in Skowhegan to house county records, to hold county meetings, to hold court for the greater Somerset County area. And the courthouse is still standing today. And that building of a brand new facility really proved to a lot of people that Skowhegan was ready to be the county seat, and it quelled not everything, but a lot of the dissent died down after that new building was built. Back here we have a number of photographs. These are from the log drive and a quotation in the center. And all these, I sort of think of them as the deleted scenes from the log drive exhibit that we have on display at History House this summer. You've got pictures that I really would have loved to have put up when I was curating the exhibit, but there just wasn't room. There's too many good pictures, there's too many good stories, so some of them were unfortunately cut. But they're very good images. There's one of a man sitting watching the falls as logs come down, and there's another one of men at a location I'm not certain of, working with pick poles and with cant dogs on logs, walking on them as they used to do in the days of the long logs. And then a few more just of life around the island in Skowhegan, where you can see the river is just absolutely full of logs. One that was a photograph taken by someone just out of curiosity. Another with some girls walking around in front of the logs and a boy on the logs in the background. And these sort of get at the way that this was just a part of life. For hundreds of years people expected to see logs in the river, and they didn't think much differently of it. Possibly my favorite item, though, that we didn't get a chance to put in is this quote from Gerald Marble, where he says, he's writing in 1963, he says, "One spectacle of a thrilling nature that has gone the way of progress was the driving of long logs in the river. It was a spectacular sight to see a 30 or 40 foot log pitch over the North Channel Dam, stand on end for a moment, and then yield to the rushing waters that carried it downstream." We like to think of the log drives the passing of the log drives as being the end of an era. The last log drives were called the end of an era log drives, in fact. But what this gets at for me is Gerald Marble in 1963 is looking back to the 1920s and 1910s when they were driving 30 and 40 foot logs down the river. That ended in 1928. And even in the 1910s and 1920s, they're looking back at a lost time of woodsmanship with even more antique instruments, with even more, much more of a, there was a big debate when crosscut saws came in, and you didn't have to cut a tree down with an axe. People said that we were losing the old ways, and that was in the mid-1800s. So everyone is always looking back to these lost eras. We're looking back to the log drives, Gerald Marble's looking back to the long log drives, and so on and so forth. It goes back, and you get this sense of history continually moving along and changing. And it's just a great image too. 30 and 40 foot logs standing up straight on end all the way up into the air on the tip of the dam, and then pitching down over it into the river. The next item we have on display is something that we mentioned in our last newsletter. This is a letter from the Revolutionary War that we just happened to run across in our archives. We were cataloging and organizing the books that we have on display, putting them in casing to be preserved carefully. And out of one of the books fell this letter, and at closer inspection we realized that this was actually a letter from the Revolutionary War, written in April 15th, 1779, by a soldier named Joshua Bailey, who was from Woolwich, Maine. Closer inspection, including a transcription of the letter, revealed a few details of Bailey's service. He was writing this letter from West Point in New York. He had participated in the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. A few months after he wrote this letter, he participated in the Battle of Stony Point, which was an important defense of Hudson River, which prevented the British from capturing the river and cutting the country in half. And most of what he writes about in this letter is money troubles. He's writing home to his wife, apologizing for not sending money along. He's earning money. The trouble is that there's no secure way to get it back to her because you'd have to send it through the mail or something like that. And what's more, the money he's earning is not as good as we would think it would be. There's a reason that we have the saying, not worth a continental. The continental money that he's earning, the first dollars, was just being printed at this time, and the American colonies were printing way too much of it to try to meet the demand, so there was massive inflation. So what Joshua Bailey is dealing with is basically all the money he's earning is worthless, and he's having a very hard time supporting his wife, so you can see some of that agony in the letter. And I can't read the whole thing out loud to you at the moment, but you're welcome to come out, take a look at the transcription if you ever come to History House. And we'd love to take you through that, or really anything. Back here, this photograph is in what they call an ambrotype photograph, which was an early type of picture. We don't know who the man is in the photograph, unfortunately, but we do know how the photograph was taken. Ambrotypes were one of the first kinds. The first kind of photograph was called a daguerreotype, and it was printed directly in silver on a copper plate and then sealed behind glass to preserve it, to keep it from tarnishing, as silver does if it's out in the open. Ambrotypes were developed a few years later in the 1850s and 60s, and with ambrotypes they basically cut out the middleman. Instead of printing them on the silver and copper and then sealing them behind glass, they just printed them on glass. What that did, though, was it meant that it was backwards. So it was actually a negative image. So the way that they combated that was by putting a piece of black backing behind the photograph. So that made the negative image appear as a positive image. The fun thing about that is if you have a broken ambrotype, one that's outside of its case, you can put it behind a black background and a white background and watch it switch from a negative to a positive. So with this one we have right here, on a black background, if you get close you can see that it is a positive image. But the second you move it over to a white image, to a white background, it becomes a negative image. And that's just a neat trick. You don't normally see that because you try to keep ambrotypes in good condition and in their cases, but luckily we had an ambrotype that was broken that came to us in bad condition. You don't normally thank your good luck for having a broken photograph, but we did with this one. These books you see back here, these are Judah McClellan's copy of Tristram Shandy. Judah McClellan was an early settler in Skowhegan. His portrait is right up on the wall back there. Judah was a graduate of Brown University in 1799, and he came up here a few years later in 1803. He practiced law and was a farmer, and apparently a very educated man. He would read French novels in the original French. He enjoyed thinking about philosophy, and he was a very well-regarded lawyer. He was apparently very strict and puritanical with his clients. He wouldn't defend anyone unless he knew that they were innocent. Anyone who was guilty, he would just tell them to throw themselves on the mercy of the court because he would not be taking their case. His grandson said that he was stern and reserved. So for that reason, I find it interesting that he would be reading a book like Tristram Shandy. For those of you who aren't familiar with Tristram Shandy, was written in the 1760s. It sort of came out of the Enlightenment ideas of the time. A lot of it is interacting with the philosophy of John Locke and others who were writing back then. So it is a fairly thoughtful, thought-provoking book that came out of a lot of a strong tradition of philosophy. However, it's also a very bawdy book. There's a lot of details in there that are much more raunchy than you would expect people to be reading in the 1700s, especially respected, very sort of stern and quiet jurists. There's, in fact, a whole bit where one of the characters is injured in the siege of a castle. A piece of the castle falls off on him and injures him in the groin, and they continue making puns about that for the rest of the book. It's also very strange. It's very strange in its structure. The book it's a biography of a character, and it takes about 3 volumes, so several hundred pages to get to his birth, because it's told by digression. The author keeps saying, well, actually, before I tell you that story, I have to tell you this story. And before I tell you that story, I have to tell you this story. So it's a very avant-garde book, a very eccentric book, and it's still an inspiration these days to a lot of writers who are on the cutting edge of experimental writing. So to picture it being in Skowhegan, read by a man like Judah McClellan, I think is a very, very interesting picture. This menu we have here, this is from the Lakewood Inn in 1896, and at that point they had just built the trolley line from Skowhegan out to Lakewood. The trolley company had just purchased the Hayden's Grove area in Lakewood, which is what they called it. It used to be Hayden Lake, and then the Lakewood area was Hayden's Grove. And the traction company, the trolley company, decided to build this up into a big attraction. They wanted a reason for people to take the trolley out there now that they'd spent all that money building the trolley. So one of the first things that they did was build Lakewood Inn. And Lakewood Inn was a hotel. It's not the one that we know today. That Lakewood Inn was demolished in the 1920s, and the current one was built afterward, I believe 1925 or 1927. At this time, when this inn was built, there were a few things that we wouldn't expect to be there: a bowling alley, a playground, a few other things. There was a steamboat that people could take for pleasure cruises out on the lake. There was obviously the trolley line. And a few years later, there would be a theater. In 1898, the first performances at Lakewood Theater happened. They were just vaudeville performances. We didn't get the annual seasons, the first technical summer of Lakewood, until 1901. So this was still a few years out from the Lakewood that we picture these days. And if you look at it, though, the food is also not quite as fancy as we would expect. They begin with lamb broth and fish chowder. Then there's a boiled leg of lamb, roast young chicken stuffed, green peas, mashed potatoes, orange jelly, and they finish it off with vanilla ice cream, and you could have tea or coffee or milk. So it's just a fairly basic menu, but it was a draw for people at the time. Down here, this chair belonged to the first preceptor, the first teacher at Bloomfield Academy. His name was James Hall, and he came over from Scotland to teach in Maine. He first taught at Bloomfield in 1814 when the school opened, and he taught there until 1828. He's apparently quite the character. He, on the way over on the boat from Scotland, lashed his oldest daughter to the mast of the boat in storm so that she could safely stay out on deck and sort of appreciate the grandeur and wonder of God's creation, was his reasoning behind it. He also was a strict disciplinarian. He would pull kids' hair to discipline them. He was very sharp-tongued to children who disobeyed. And he was also apparently of very rough manners. People complained that he would sit back in his chair with his feet up on the stove, smoking a pipe while he lectured. But he was also, there was a reason why they were employing him. He was a very sharp man. He knew quite a lot about a lot of subjects. According to Louis Coburn, he was the best mathematician in the state, and his students absolutely stood up for him. His students actually very much supported him. Despite everything he did for them, they instilled a lot of trust in him. In fact, in 1828, he was forced out of his position by the people of the town. And the only people who were willing to stand up for him were his students. They wrote several letters of support for him. So this is a map of Skowhegan from 1874. And I had this on display partly because I just think that maps are really fun to look at, and you get a lot of information from them in a very easy to digest form. This one especially, you've got every single house lot, every single building lot, the name of the owner or company. It's a very useful map for trying to make sense of what Skowhegan looked like back in the day. And there's a lot of differences that are very apparent at a first glance. For one, the center of town wasn't quite the triangle, the rotary that we think of as the center now, which is sort of a shopping and business center. The center was more along the island, because this was back when there were a large number of factories in Skowhegan, and they all depended on water power. In 1874, there wasn't an electric power generating plant in town. It wasn't common to have electric power generated. If you wanted something to be powered, you had to do it yourself, usually by building a water wheel. So all of these streets that we have in Skowhegan that are just about abandoned now, Mill Street, which is on the south side of the river, on the east side of the bridge, these days is just, I believe it's even blocked off now. It's empty, but back then it was a bustling street with 5, 6, 7 mills on it, a pulp company, a lumber company, I believe a worsted mill. There was just about many different types of industry on there, all taking advantage of the fact that they had access to the rushing water of Skowhegan Falls. Dodge Street, which is equally deserted these days. That's at the very beginning of Water Street on your left when you're coming off the bridge onto Water Street. Deserted these days. Those days there was an American woolen company there was a pulp company there, very big street back in the day. And the island too was dotted with all of these mills that were taking advantage of the water power. Another thing that we don't have anymore is the railroad coming right into the center of town. The station would have been in the parking lot, the municipal parking lot, right behind Heights. The railed sheds where they stored various goods that were coming in by rail were where Cumberland Farms is now. That part, all at the center of town, was the railroad. And then you can see other differences to town. Coburn Park was just land owned by the Coburns, had not yet been donated. It was, in fact, seen as a little bit too far out of town to be useful as a park. A bit of a walk for people. The fairgrounds are still here, and they were back in the photo, but they look very far out of town in this map. You get out into farmland at that point. It's not shopping centers these days. It's just all farmland back then. And it was a trotting park first and a fairground second. I always think that's a fun turn of phrase. And then if you get up close, you can see all these little details that really say a lot, I think. My favorite one is at the very top of Madison Avenue. There's 2 hills, and when you get to the top of the hills, when you're heading north towards Madison, if you look to your right, there's a series of houses, including Helen's Bed and Breakfast, that are all brick houses. And yet there's almost no other houses on Madison Avenue that are brick houses. Well, if you look at this photo here, right behind where those houses are, you can see a brickyard. So there's a ready source of bricks right there, and suddenly things start to make sense. It's fun to look at old maps like this and try to see why things are the way they are today. You can pick out all these little details. So I would really invite anyone who's been interested by any of this to come on down to History House. We have all these items, maybe not on display, but if you ask nicely, we'll get them out for you. If you want to take a look through any of our archives, they're open to anyone who wants to do some research. We have a lot on display, but we have even more that we don't have the space to display, and we love talking about it. So thanks for watching.